Hello. Hello to everyone. I think it's 1 o'clock, so we can start our webinar today. My name is Patrycja Matusz, and I'm from the University of Wrocław in Poland. I'm going to chair this meeting today. I would like to welcome in this Zoom in on migration and asylum webinar the team of ADMIGOV researchers from the work package 3 who worked on the seasonal and circular migration. Today we would like to present the results from the work package 3 from the Horizon 2020 ADMIGOV project. ADMIGOV, it's about advancing alternative migration governance. And today we are going to split this session in 2 parts. In the first one, we would like to talk about the results from our 4 case studies. I would say a few words about this in a second. There are 3 presentations. The first one by Berta Güell from Barcelona about the Spanish case. The second one by Jeroen Dummerning from Amsterdam about the Dutch and German case. And the last one by myself about the Polish case. After the presentation of the results, we would like to follow with the policy recommendations presented by Blanca Garces Macarenas from Spain, Jeroen again from Amsterdam, and the Polish recommendation is going to be presented by Irini Iveliotu from the Polish team. Before we start, I would like to thank for the organization of this webinar to Marit Thiem from Traffic Project and Anja van Hilsum, who is the coordinator of ADMIGOV project. Our presentation would be followed by the comments and questions by Panos Hadji Prokopiou. I tried very best. And we are going to open the session for the questions from public. We would like to ask you to use the Q&A session to ask the question, and I hope we are going to have a very interesting and fruitful conversation. We are waiting for all interesting comments and feedback to our results. Before we start, a few words about the work package 3 of the ADMIGOV project. Our aim was to analyze and to investigate the policy scheme in the area of circular and seasonal migration. First of all, we wanted to look at the 4 national cases and compare them in order to come up with a recommendation for the further developments in this area. Because of the pandemic and the problems that all the European countries have been facing in the last months, we had to change our aim a little bit, and we decided to look at the agriculture as the main area, which of course is the one of the most important sector of the labor market in which the seasonal and circular migrants are employed. We decided to look at the phenomenon of coronavirus and the impact of the regulations and some changes in the legal solutions in the area of seasonal and circular migration, and of course look at the working and living conditions of circular and seasonal migration in the given countries. As far as we know, the labor market regulations have been implemented in all the cases as a result of increasing demand in workers, primarily, as I said, in agriculture, but also in other sectors. We know that migrants, seasonal and circular migrants, play a very important role in work as a workforce, and without them, many sectors will suffer a lot of problems. If we look at the work package 3, what we can say about the way we investigated this, the research started with the analysis of the existing body of literature and of course other research results, but also the official documents, the legal regulations on seasonal and circular migration. This analysis were followed by the empirical material, which was collected based on the qualitative research. We decided to conduct the in-depth semi-structured interviews with diverse stakeholders active in the area of seasonal and circular migration. And by this, I mean, of course, the representatives of the public and private institutions, recruitment agencies, labor organization, NGOs, etc. But I think more we can talk about the interviews by looking at the field by the country reports. Due to the COVID restrictions, some of our interviews were conducted online, which is very pity. Sometimes it's more difficult to get the access to the interviewers. But I think we've got a lot of interesting material, and I hope the country cases are going to be interesting for our participants. Because the time is very limited and there is a lot of interesting material from the country case studies, I would like to ask Berta to start with the first presentation about the Spanish case. I have to remind you that we have about 10 minutes for each presentation. Please be aware about this because we want to have the Q&A session followed after the presentation. Berta, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Traffic and Admigo for organizing this webinar. I will share my screen so that you can follow the PowerPoint. You see it all right, huh? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to present the Spanish case. We have concentrated on 2 case studies. We have done research in 2 provinces in Spain, which are Lleida in Catalonia and Huelva in Andalusia. And these are the 2 provinces with highest quotes of seasonal workers recruited in the country of origin. And those that have historically the programs of circular migration that have been more important within the country, and that actually have been regarded as a model of reference by the EU in the early 2000s when they were set in place. Both provinces have intensive models of agriculture, which are highly dependent on exports and international markets. About 70 or 80% of all the fruits that are harvested in these 2 provinces are exported outside Spain, mainly to Europe. So they are really, really dependent on exports and international markets. Lleida is specialized in sweet fruits. By that we mean peaches and nectarines mostly, but also apples and pears to lesser extent. And almost 80% of what they produce is of all the sweet fruits are produced in Catalonia are produced in Lleida. And the campaign starts around June and it's until September, so it's during the summer, and it gives jobs for about 30,000 workers. In Huelva, Huelva is specialized in red berries. It started with strawberries, but it has increasingly diversified their production, and now they are harvesting different red berries. And Huelva has 90% of all red berries of Andalusia. The campaign is much longer. It starts in December and it ends in June. And it's much bigger in comparison to Lleida, and it hosts about 100,000 workers. Now I will present the findings of how the pandemic has affected the campaign in agriculture in 3 different areas. One is recruitment, and then I will talk about working conditions and living conditions. Starting with recruitment, we have to say that during when the pandemic started, employers were really afraid of who would harvest the fruit, because the borders were closed and there were lots of restrictions for mobility. And Lleida is really dependent on Eastern European workers and Huelva also, but Huelva hosts many workers from Morocco. They are the Moroccan women that pick up the strawberries and other red berries. So when the pandemic started and the borders were closed, there was much pressure from employers to set a cordon sanitaire and at least receive some of the workers from Eastern Europe, mainly Romania, to work in the plants and in the field. And after some negotiations, they managed to at least receive half of the workers from Romania in the case of Lleida. Huelva was more affected by the closure of borders in Morocco. Before March, only 7,000 out of the 19,000 Moroccan women had arrived in Spain. So there were 12,000 workers that could not arrive, and they needed to be substituted by other workers. And some of the Moroccan women, these 7,000, could expand their labor contracts, but actually only 10% could do that. So it was also very hard to manage the situation of these 7,000 Moroccan women that were stuck in Spain and could not go back to Morocco until July, that it opened the borders again, just for them. The government, in the meantime, also approved a decree law and tried to do some regulations to attract other profiles in agriculture, like migrant youth, asylum seekers, or unemployed. But it did not succeed a lot, and only some migrant youth entered the sector. So in the end, mainly who harvested the fruit was migrant workers that were already living in Spain, and because they were considered essential workers, they got a certificate of mobility, and if they had a job contract, they could move across provinces within Spain and work in the different campaigns. Having said that, Huelva, because the pandemic affected in the middle of the campaign, because as I said, the campaign in Huelva starts in December, so they had more problems to find enough labor demand, and in the end, there was a 20% reduction of production. In relation to the working conditions, the pandemic has made the structural problems and the bad working conditions more visible than ever. And workers have complained of being much more under stress due to these labor shortages, because people that were supposed to arrive could not make it. And so they were much more stressed to produce. And although this logic is already present in previous years, but this year it was harsher. Also, the difficulties to reach workplaces were mentioned. There were instructions that only 2 people could be within a car. So those people, those workers that have less resources and had more difficulties to reach the workplaces had to be involved in more dangerous practices. And some like supervisors made lots of money charging high sums of money to those that had no cars or means of transport to get to the workplaces. So this was an issue, the transport also. And in some cases, NGOs reported that some workers were even dismissed if they didn't have any means of transport to get to the workplace, which is not a very good practice. In terms of labor inspections, these were telematic during the lockdown, so they were quite useless. And once the mobility was a little bit easier, the national government reinforced actually the labor inspections after the media covered lots of labor abuses that were being produced in the field. This year, the media has been quite active in talking about this issue because, as I said, the working conditions and the structural problems have been made much more visible. So in response, the government tried to reinforce the labor inspections and more irregularities were uncovered. On the side of employers, they have felt quite abandoned by the government. The instructions and the guidelines, the official, were not always clear. And despite, although they were implementing protocols and they were supposed to provide sanitary material for workers, these workers not always felt protected. And there have been also complaints in terms of public health issues. And finally, I'm going to talk about the living conditions. These have been always quite worrying. I mean, before the pandemic started, the living conditions were already very bad for temporary workers. And this is because, well, the collective bargaining agreements are not always respected. In the case of Lleida, for instance, those workers that live farther from 75 kilometers away from their home, they need to be provided with accommodations, and employers need to find accommodation for them. The problem is because more and more temp agencies are involved in the subcontracting of temporary workers. These don't take the responsibility of finding accommodation for these workers. So there's a legal gap there, and no one takes responsibility. And this fosters situations of substandard housing, overcrowding of flats, and even homelessness. Those undocumented workers that are in a more precarious situation and have that work in the agriculture but informally without a job contract, those are the ones that are more vulnerable and are more but could find themselves in a situation of homelessness or overcrowded flats. Lleida witnessed the first outbreaks in the summer. After the strict lockdown, Lleida was the first region or one of the first regions in Spain that witnessed outbreaks. And these were related to agriculture and the bad living conditions of temporary workers. And in Huelva stands out for having these informal settlements. In Lleida, these informal settlements don't exist. But in Huelva they do, and actually it's not a new phenomenon. It has also existed for years, but now with the pandemic, this has also been made more clear, and it has been said and criticized that the situation there is very dangerous also in terms of public health. This year, 2020, it was okay in terms of outbreaks. The incidence of COVID was really low, and it did not reach the informal settlements. But the forecast for this new campaign in 2021, this year, is not very good because COVID already is much more present in Huelva nowadays. So they have to be much more careful with what will happen in the informal settlements and all the people that are living there. So city councils and the public administration should really think if destroying shanties and not providing alternative for these workers is the best strategy. Not only to respect the right of access to decent housing, but also in terms of public health. And I will finish here my presentation and give the floor to Jeroen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Berta, for the very interesting presentation. Immediately after we go with Jeroen, because as I said, the time is limited. So Jeroen, please take the floor.
Thank you, Patricia. Before zooming in on agriculture, I would like to say a few things about more general immigration policies in Germany and the Netherlands, because that makes for a very interesting comparison. Both countries, on the one hand, are very keen to attract migrant workers from third countries who are highly skilled. In the Netherlands, since 2013, there's a policy that actually allows anyone who has a college education from a decent university can come in and look for work for a whole year or try to create their own business within this 1 year. Germany, since last year, has a new law called the Law on Fachkräftemangel, which is about people being attractive to people from third countries who bring certain desired skills, not necessarily of a university level, but professional skills. So people actually know a trade. And if you go to the website Make It in Germany, which is in English, obviously, you can see how easy it is for skilled people to go and live and work in Germany. And these people will receive a permanent residence permit relatively soon. So this is a settlement policy. At the same time, if you look at third country nationals, the Netherlands is very reluctant to take in anyone who does not have a college degree. So if an employer needs an unskilled worker or a poorly skilled worker from a third country, it's going to be extremely tough. He needs to demonstrate there's really no one else within the whole European Economic Area who could actually take that particular job. The Germans, in contrast, are much more open to hiring people from third countries, and especially since 2016, when they introduced the West Balkan Regelung, which was created with a view to offer alternative ways into Germany for people who then, at the particular 2015, 2016, at the height of the refugee crisis, came from the Balkans applying for asylum, which of course was not in all cases appropriate. So if you do not apply for asylum, then you can come and work in Germany. And I think by now about 250,000 people have enjoyed that opportunity, and their skills are not important. If there's an employer who needs them, who wants them, they can come. It's as simple as that. And there are also now discussions about having certain bilateral agreements with, for instance, Georgia or some other countries in order to actually open up more room for unskilled workers to come and work and perhaps even stay longer in Germany. Also quite interesting is the way rejected asylum seekers are viewed. In Germany, they are seen, at least partly, as a labor reserve, whereas in the Netherlands, we have a much more strict idea about what should happen with people who are rejected asylum seekers. In the Dutch case, they are excluded from everything, access to the labor market, access to welfare, whereas in Germany, if they can't be expelled effectively, they actually receive a tolerated status, which is not really a status, but it might offer them a way into the labor market and into professional training. And if that may then be a way in for these people, that is into a permanent residence permit. So there's a very different take on what you can do with migrants who spontaneously turn up. Now let's zoom in. And by the way, of these tolerated people, there are about 200,000 right now, and of those 40,000 are employed, so 20%, which is quite a large number. Agricultural work. In Germany, this is truly seasonal because it's usually out in the fields. So it's employment from, let's say, March until October, when the wine is harvested. and then people probably will go home. Whereas in the Dutch case, many of the of the agricultural work is actually done in greenhouses, which is much less tied to the seasons, which also explains why when the pandemic struck in March, the effects was very different. Although the evidence is partly anecdotal, because statistics on all of this is very difficult or hardly existing. But it would seem that in the Dutch case, what basically meant that the demand for labor dropped a little bit in the agricultural sector, because the demand for the products dropped and the exports, of course, became problematic. Whereas in Germany, where in March the first seasonal workers were expected to arrive, the supply of workers dropped because the borders were closed effectively. And then what the employers at first tried to do was supplement the existing labor force by people who would not normally go into the fields, let's say students or unemployed people or asylum seekers. Asylum seekers in Germany can work much more easily than they can in the Netherlands. But this was not particularly effective. And so the government had to come up with a solution, and it then opened up again the doors for Central and Eastern European workers, which is the largest chunk of seasonal workers in Germany. But not as many as would normally have come. And they made a legal change. If in Germany you're a foreigner, you can work for 70 days in any year without paying taxes or insurance premiums. And they extended this to 115 days. So to make it attractive for people to stay on and be more productive. Then, of course, what it brought to light, the whole pandemic, was very abusive working conditions, especially in the Netherlands. Because it turned out that in the Netherlands, almost everyone who's a migrant worker is hired via temp agencies. They are the actual employers, by the way, and then they send people on secondment to the actual employers in the greenhouses or in the fields. And this opens up a whole business model for earning money of employing people. So not necessarily the work is bringing you money, no, the employment of these people brings you money. Because the law says that you need to offer them housing, and the law says you can charge 20% of the minimum wage for this particular housing. But then if this means that people are living, are using beds in 6 beds in 1 bedroom, for instance, then it's completely substandard, but you have to pay the 200 euros. So that's the type of business model that has arisen in the Netherlands. And there's very little labor inspectorate to look into all of this. And COVID, of course, made this very clear, because people then all of a sudden could not keep their distance in that type of living conditions, could also not keep their distance in many of the workplaces. This then inspired the government to convene an investigation, a committee that should actually look into it, and it came up with many examples of abusive circumstances. This business model also appears in Germany, but much less so, because since it's work in the fields, people are often hired directly by farmers, not by intermediaries, and therefore the trust becomes very important, because the employer needs these people to come back next year. And often these are very long-standing relationships between employers and certain villages, in particular, let's say in Bulgaria, Romania, or in Poland. So the Netherlands will see new laws on temp agencies, probably, that might reduce the scope for abuse. Although whether it will go away entirely, we don't know, probably not. And what we also see, and this is interesting speaking with employers, that we will probably see technological innovation. There already are now today machines available that will do the harvesting in the greenhouses. It might also be possible to harvest asparagus with machines or berries. But right now it's still, the machines are more expensive than the people, therefore people will remain to be attracted. And the German Employment Agency is already thinking about, once the pandemic is over, to go back to Georgia and see whether they can hire people there. And maybe if the West Balkan Regeling will run out at some point, they will also do bilateral agreements with the Balkan states in order to have a labor reserve that might work the fields. Right, I think that's enough for me now. Let's move on to Poland, to Patricia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeroen. I'm going to try to present something. Yes, it's here. Just a second. Okay, we finished with the Polish case, which is slightly different than the Western European and Southern European countries, because what we have been facing in the last years is a very dynamic inflow of migrants from neighboring countries, and we are in the process of changing from the emigration to the immigration country in a very rapid way. I think that we need to say that Poland has been considered as an immigration country for many years after the transformation in the 90s. And the tendency was strengthened by the huge outflow of Polish workers to the EU member states, and it's linked me to the Jeroen cases, because the temporary and seasonal migrants in the Netherlands came from Poland in many cases. So the high outflow of Polish workers, it's about 2 million after the EU enlargement in 2004, together with other factors as very low unemployment in Poland, good economic condition and development. I would say the unemployment in Poland in 2019 was about 3.5%, so it's very low, and the GDP in 2018 was 5.1. So we can say that Poland was not hit by the crisis of 2008-2009. So all this kind of economic developments, together with the high outflow of Polish workers, caused the high demand in labor migrants. As you can see on the screen, the report of International Organization for Migration published the data from the 2017, which shows that 660,000 resident permits for a new migrants were recorded in Poland. The majority of them are Ukrainians, it's 85%. And if we look at the numbers from the Central Statistical Office from Poland from 2016, it's more than 740 foreigners living in Poland as a new with the new permit. So as you can see, it's a quite dynamic inflow. If we look at the development of the seasonal and circular migration schemes, I would say that it's a very interesting case, because in general, Poland has not developed a migration strategy or policy at the national level, and all kind of solutions which were implemented were very fragmented and related to the specific groups. In our case, the short-term and circular migration, the solutions implemented by the Polish government were the answer to this growing demand on the labor market, firstly in agriculture and lately in other sectors. If we look at the system of work permits, this solution is something very interesting. It's based on the declaration of intention to entrust work to foreigners, which we call the simplified procedure. It means that the Polish government implemented the solution, which is very accessible for the seasonal and circular migrants. It's very easy to to get the access to the Polish labor market. And the seasonal and circular migrants might stay from 6 up to 9 months in Poland, and then come back in the circular way. Of course, this simplified procedure was implemented for some neighboring countries and the countries which are mentioned on the slide. But as I said, the Ukrainians are the dominant group, which is related also to the situation, economic and political situation in Ukraine. The economic crisis is, of course, the push factor for the Ukrainian workers to come to Poland. This simplified procedure is very accessible for migrants, as I said, and quite easy for the employers as well, because there is only a kind of registration in the local employer offices, which takes up to 2 weeks. So it's quite easy to register the migrant, and then for the migrant to stay in Poland and work for the 6 to 9 months. It means, and of course, because this system is very easy and accessible for both employers and migrants, if we look at the numbers of the declarations, you can see that they are enormous. We started with, let's say, 200,000 in 2009. And if you look at the numbers for 2017, it's almost 2 million, which means that the increase is enormous. It doesn't mean that all those people entered Poland and started to work in Poland, because one employer might register more than one worker, and of course the worker might ask more than one employer to register. So it means that not all those numbers mean real people working in Poland, but still there were almost 2 million declaration for the temporary migrants in Poland, which means a huge increase. When I go back for a while, as I said, the system of circular migration started with the agriculture, but then the other sectors were open for it. And I might say that the temporary and seasonal migrants are employed in all sectors of the Polish labor market. And we know that without them, as you look at the numbers, there were several sectors might severe a serious problem. So I would say if we look at the COVID and the pandemic situation, what was the most important and what our interviewers mentioned? Poland was the first country, one of the first countries which implemented a very restrictive measures for, on March 2019, the Polish government introduced the closure of borders, and it was the critical moment for the hundreds of temporary migrants living in Poland, because there was no Airbus or any other traffic. And what was important for both the stakeholders, but also for the migrants which I interviewed, was that there was the misinformation. And it's something which really illustrates the kind of ignorance of the public institutions, because on the one hand, we do have a rapid and quite very high inflow of migrants to Poland, but on the other hand, they are seen only as a temporary migrant. So there is a lack of any kind of, I would say, integration measure in order to give them, to inform them, to give them the information about their rights and the situation in Poland. So what migrants told me during the field work was that they were afraid of the closed borders, and they faced the fear about the consequences of this closure, and according to the numbers, between March and April 2019, around 2,000 mainly Ukrainian workers decided to leave Poland, which was a huge group of migrants. They told during the research that, and it was the 10% drop of all migrants living in Poland, this 2,000 people. They went to Ukraine because of many reasons, because of the closed borders, because of the quarantine which was introduced, and of course because of the families that were left in the country of origin. But if we look at the numbers from the autumn, this decrease were reduced, and temporary and seasonal migrants decided to come back to Poland in autumn. However, it was before the introduction of the different restrictions and the part of the lockdown. So if we look at the consequences for the labor market, it's very difficult to say if the demand is going to stay at the same level, because the lockdown is causing a lot of troubles for the small and medium entrepreneurs. So it's difficult to say if there will be a demand for this mass migration in Poland. And if we look at the legal solutions which were implemented, as I said, there was a lack of any kind of information campaign or any kind of information to this temporary and seasonal migrants about the regulations, about the closure of borders. But the Polish government introduced something called anti-crisis shield, which was addressed to entrepreneurs, but also to migrants. In the very beginning, in April, there was a regulation allowing people being in different stage of their registration in Poland to stay legally in Poland, and to give them the 90 days after the lockdown to register and to clarify their legal status, which was, in the opinion of the migrants I interviewed, the very important thing, because the fear of overstay and the fear of becoming, let's say, irregular migrant in the time of pandemia was something which pushed them back to the country of origin, because the situation of, let's say, the papers or the permits were something quite important for them. So everyone said that this regulation, giving migrants time to register and to clarify their legal situation after the lockdown was something highly appreciated by both entrepreneurs and migrants. If I may say just a few words about the living and working condition, if we look at the let's say history of the inflow to Poland after the transformation in the 90s and 2000, before the high wave of temporary and seasonal migrants from the neighboring countries, different categories of migrants were based mainly in Warsaw and the Mazowieckie region, which is the region of the capital city. But in the last 5 years, the geographical distribution of migrants is very interesting, and it's all over Poland. So Warsaw stopped to be the main place of residence. It's interesting that seasonal and temporary migrants are also based in very small cities and in the rural areas, which is of course typical and related to the agriculture. If we look at the living conditions, to relate my presentation to what Berta said, in Poland the situation is worst in the big cities, and I would say much better in the small cities, when the entrepreneurs have developed different way of accommodating temporary migrants. And in the case of big cities, they are sharing flats and apartment, as Jarun said, for one apartment for many people. And I would say the situation is worse than in case of the big agriculture factories outside the cities, more in the rural areas. So just to sum up, it's quite difficult to say how the situation would look like in the months to come, but because of the possible economic impact of pandemia to different sectors, I can say that the restaurant and the hotels and the tourism industry is closed for many weeks. So it might be an impact on the demand of temporary migrants. But from the interviews, we know that many of them decided to stay in Poland, even in the hard times of even having the problem with the employers, because the situation, the economic situation in Ukraine is even worse. And what was very interesting from the field work, migrants told us that they are staying in Poland because of the access to the healthcare sector, and they told us that okay, if they compare the access to the hospitals in time of pandemia, it's better in Poland than in the country of origin. So that was also the reason. Okay, thank you. Okay, I shouldn't say thank you, because it should be the thank you for myself. Okay, going further, I would follow with the, or I don't know, Panos, do you want to comment now on something, or after the recommendations? Because maybe it's something that you would like to say now.
I'm not sure, as you like. I have drafted a couple of notes trying to note some common themes around the very different cases, and it was very beneficial for me, very helpful to have had a look at the reports that are online. So whatever you think works better for us.
If it's nothing very important at the moment, we would like to wait. And yeah, Blanca, the floor is yours, and please start with the recommendation from the Spanish case.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. I hope you can hear me well. I'll be very brief, because we are all looking forward to the comments by Panos, and I think that we also have some experts in the audience, so we are also looking forward to the discussion afterwards. All our recommendations for the Spanish case in the short, mid, and long term are in the report, which is already online, so I won't refer to all of them. In this couple of minutes, I would like, Patricia, could you please delete your PowerPoint from the screen? Yes. Okay, now, thank you. So I would like basically to come back to the four main problems Berta and I have identified in the report. And in relation to these four main problems, list or enumerate a couple of recommendations. As I said, the recommendations, all of them are in our report, so I won't repeat and go through all of them. The first main problem, and I would say that this is common to all of our cases, has to do with labor conditions, with these poor labor conditions. Jeroen referred to them as abusive labor conditions, which have to do with the deregulation of the sector and the presence, also in the case of Spain, of these debt agencies, which dilute responsibilities. It has to do as well with the lack of control mechanisms, and this is clear in the case of Spain, maybe less in the case of the Netherlands and Germany. And also, and I think that this is also important, more generally, this lack of these poor labor conditions have also to do with the dynamics of the global markets and an unequal redistribution of costs and benefits between center and periphery. And in this case, Spain lies more in the periphery than in the center in terms of cost and benefits within this global market. So in response to that, we suggest a couple of recommendations. In the short term, compliance, of course, with the collective bargaining agreement. This is clear, this is obvious, but this is not always the case. And this includes increasing, of course, the number of labor inspections and improving the labor conditions by changing the regulations and updating the salary scale. This at the short term. In the long term, this should be accompanied by a more structural change, and meaning basically by the promotion of a more sustainable agrarian model, questioning the basis of this big scale intensive agriculture, which at the end results in this precarious labor. This was the first problem. The second problem has to do with access to housing and living conditions, poor living conditions, and Bert explained them very well for the case of Spain. The pandemic has been especially harsh in making visible the deficiencies of housing for temporary workers, whereas in Huelva, as Berta said, the situation is extremely worrying due to the proliferation of these informal settlements. In Lleida, problems are more related to homelessness, overoccupation of flats, and substandard housing. So here we identify two main recommendations. First of all, the creation of a coordinated network of public hostels. First of all, to increase the number of places available, and also as a coordinated network to coordinate and have a bigger picture of what capacity these hostels have, and also about the needs in relation to the available places. And second, this is our second recommendation with regard to this access to housing, to promote the dialogue between the actors involved in the organization of these agricultural campaigns. Basically, because what we see is an exchange of an endless discussion between stakeholders, and particularly between different administrative levels. So we think that it's fundamental that we really have a dialogue between the main stakeholders in order to plan, to negotiate, and to make clear the division of responsibilities, also with regard to this access to housing for temporary agricultural workers. The third problem has to do with these circular or temporary labor programs. And here we are referring to the employment of mostly female Moroccan workers. The need or wish from the side of these workers to repeat in future campaigns, and the requirement under which these workers are recruited, and they are recruited explicitly as women, mothers from rural areas and with limited resources, make them, these workers, highly dependent on employers, which means that their well-being depends at the end on the whim and ethics of the employer. So here we suggest we extremely need more control and monitoring to ensure compliance with contractual conditions and labor rights, more services of mediation and translation, training to employers, and not only to employers, but particularly to middle ranking positions, and also training to workers, basically about their rights. Often they don't know about their rights. And also lobbying for the implementation of online mechanisms in trials, basically to allow the possibility to get to court in case labor conditions and living conditions are not ensured. And finally, and this is more a kind of remark, the pandemic has made clear that contrary to what the extreme right defends, our security depends on their rights. So it's not our security versus their rights, but our security depends on their rights. So only by ensuring their rights in terms of labor and living conditions and in terms of access to healthcare, it's possible to implement an efficient public health policy. So again, here we need better labor conditions and ensure the compliance of our own labor laws and legislation, better housing conditions and living conditions, access, universal access to healthcare. And here, of course, it's really important and I would say urgent to have a regularization of irregular migrants, precisely to reduce informal economy, to guarantee human and labor rights, and to ensure this inclusion in the system, and in this system also to the healthcare system. Of course, in Italy, we have seen a regularization, particularly in this sector, and as a result of this situation, the pandemic. Not in the case of Spain, it could have been the case. The conditions are there as they were in 2005 and in the regularizations of 2000, 2001, 2002. But I would say that in the case of Spain, the reasons are there, that we are in a highly politicized context, and this is the reason why we have not seen a regularization yet. And finally, the campaign will start soon in the case of Spain, particularly in Huelva in February, March. So all these things should have been tackled already. Otherwise, we will witness some of the situations we have seen in 2020. And basically, I would say that we cannot afford it. We cannot afford it again. So let's see what happens in 2021. So I think that now is Irene's turn. No? Irene?
I think it's Jeroen's
No,
turn.
not yet. There is the Jeroen turn.
Sorry, Jeroen. Sorry,
It's
Jeroen.
okay, Blanca, it's fine.
I lost the...
In as far as applicable to the Dutch and the German labor markets, I would completely concur with Blanca just said. We need more enforcement. But I think that we should discuss the possibility of taking a European approach. I think the Commission could do more in order to protect EU nationals who work in other EU countries, and also do more to protect third country nationals, other than the directive that currently exists, but actually is targeted at employers who hire in an irregular manner third country nationals. I think that could be worked upon, that could be expanded. So some kind of directive that would actually safeguard or take away many of the abusive practices that we see now. And I'm particularly thinking of one thing that I didn't mention yet, is that in the Dutch case, temp agencies usually work with a 0-hour contract, which basically means that if there's no one who wants to physically really employ a migrant worker, there is really no income. And it's completely unfair that, I mean, if I am employed, regularly employed by someone, and then all of a sudden university says, well, today I have no work for you, so I won't pay you. I mean, that would be unheard of. Whereas this is the common practice with seasonal workers or agricultural workers in the Netherlands who are working via temp agency. So that might be something that you could put into EU regulation. Actually, say 0-hour contracts, we don't do that anymore within Europe. The second is then, of course, then regulate the temp agency as a free market, as it is today in the Netherlands, but this is being worked upon, as I already mentioned. I think the Dutch government will do something against this. And thirdly, what I think would be important, that there's a public relations campaign making very clear to everyone in the European Union how vital, how extremely important these seasonal workers, agricultural workers actually are. If without them, and Blanca already hinted in this, I mean, their rights are also very important to our health. and to our well-being. So that too, I think, could be something that Europe, the European Commission, should think about, and facilitate a kind of an awareness-raising campaign in conjunction, perhaps, with a directive that would try to remedy many of these ailments that we have identified. So that's enough for me.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, Irini, about Poland again. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Yes, indeed, I hope I'm not the least. So talking about Poland, I hope that you could see full screen. Yes, now. So what we did is that we divided the recommendation short term so that we can cover the recent campaigns, agricultural campaigns of 2021, and mid and long term for long lasting effects. So talking about the short-term recommendations, from our field work, we could see that some employers were suggesting that in the following campaigns, we might see some decrease on the wages, particularly the poultry sector, which is one of the biggest exporters of Poland, currently has seen a drop in the sales, particularly in the Western Europe, which is the biggest export destination. So it is very possible, but considering the circumstances, if we lower the wages, it could actually be a turn-off for some Ukrainians to come as our dominant group. A second thing would be about the increase of the labor inspectors. So as we said, during the COVID, they were giving 1 month afterwards, after the emergency case, to again set their applications, but there was a lot of big problems in the government offices with the inspectors in the offices, but also there were not enough hotlines for the migrants to actually speak and ask questions, and at the same time there are not a lot of labor inspectors to check the working and living conditions in the smaller towns. Again, when it comes to the cooperation of different actors involved, we saw that the Polish government closed and implemented the restrictions on the 15th of March 2020. And because of the delay for the response from the Ukrainian authorities to explain to the Ukrainians the situation in Poland, a lot of Ukrainians fled in the fear that they will be trapped either in Poland or they will not be able to enter Ukraine. If there was a better cooperation between the migrant networks and the Polish government, this would have been prevented. Another thing would be the better health support. Bianca already discussed about it, but also here in Poland currently, if you would like to take a PCR test privately, it's 500 zloty, equals to 120 euros. In some cases, the employers had to pay for their workers, 1,000 zloty they had workers, and they all complained that that was a more burden for the farmers to pay, and also the sanitations in the farms, according to our field work, they were not kept, masks were not worn, and a lot of cases of spread in smaller villages occurred. When it comes to midterm recommendations, in our work package, but also in the ADMICOF, we want to foster the good practices for safe and orderly migration. And we think that declaration, it's a simplified procedure that might help the inflow of migrants. These cases of good practices should be known to the public, to the employers, to the migrant networks. And also, when it comes to the Polish agriculture, we're talking about a more mechanized agriculture than Spain, not in the degree of the Netherlands and Germany, but we're talking about trained migrants. And in the case of the COVID again, the Polish farmers tried to employ in the beginning Uzbeks and Georgians, but they were not as productive as and trained Ukrainians. So we could see that if we maybe have some foreign managers, we can reinforce circular migration, but also we can actually increase the production. Another thing is the social inclusion. As Professor Matou said, we have transformed from an immigration country to an immigration, but it is not actually known to the wider public to understand that the changes might mean also integration of the migrants. The migrants are marginalized in the smaller towns. And what we can all agree from this webinar is that the temporary migrants are being seen in every single country as essential workers for the GDP of the host community. So it's actually benefiting the host community. And finally, when it comes to the irregular migration, in some cases, we have here also hourly works that could be bending the laws of regular work. So that must be regulated better. Finally, when it comes to the long-term regulation recommendations, when we were trying with Professor Matos to find information about the statistics of the migrants, we can find from the zoos, from FEPESEL, which is a number that the migrants will take, from the National Health Insurance, but all of these data were not the same, they were fragmented. Maybe a nationwide body will make us actually aware of concrete numbers. Also, when it comes to the policy sectors, when we talk about agriculture, we're talking about fisheries, about poultry, beef, fruits. And when we saw the COVID, we saw that particularly the migrants of the strawberries and asparagus, they were the ones that they were hit because these soft fruits were rotten and they wanted immediate migrants. Whereas when it comes to poultry, we could see from the Bank of Poland that actually due to the COVID, they were not hit as much. So maybe if we would like to regulate, we would need to narrow down to sector specific. And finally, as we said before, a better collaboration between the recruitment agencies. We saw that when the Polish government applied the anti-crisis shield in the beginning of May, this was because of the pressure on a collaboration of all the actors. And that should not be applied only in the COVID period, but also in general. And finally, as a message to take away again from our presentation, I think with Professor Matus, is that Poland maybe needs more circular migration over seasonal migration. Our interviewee suggested that we have all year long migration, not seasonal per se. So it will be more beneficial for the country to reinforce circular patterns. And I will take only 1 minute. Okay.
No,
Lydia,
no, Eirini, I can stop.
I can stop.
You have to stop because I received the information that we need more time for questions.
Okay.
So
I think I will repeat again what Bianca said. So thank you very much.
Okay, and now it's time for Panos and for comments, and we are really looking forward to hear your comments. Please.
For that, and thank you all for your presentations and policy recommendations for the work behind this. Yeah, very interesting altogether. I was a bit reluctant at the first place when Anya invited me because I'm not particularly expert on the rural sector and migrants in agriculture. But I find it also challenging, and I have to say, looking also into the reports, I have learned a lot and try to make some parallels with what I know from the Greek case and the work we are doing in the context of the traffic project, despite not directly looking into this. So what I'll try to do in the first, let's say, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, is to draw some you know, as deriving from my going through the reports and hearing your vivid presentations, some what I think as common themes from the otherwise very different cases within you know, southern and eastern and northwestern Europe, with very different patterns, countries that is, with very different patterns and histories and policies of migration. And different labor markets and employment and production structures as well. You just need to stop me. I have to say this beforehand if you think I'm going too far, because I have a few things to say about the policy recommendations too. Perhaps they're not in a very good order, but one thing that comes that comes like common, even if in different ways, different sort of detail, is the policy gaps, the policy responses. I'm not referring only to the policy responses in view of the pandemic and the need to regulate or make space for people to sort out their lives or to respond to demands risen by employers in the context of labor shortages induced by the lockdown and so on. But generally speaking, policy gaps in regarding seasonal and circular migrant work in the agricultural, or let me say, because that's what especially in the Dutch, German, and possibly also Polish case come more to mount, the agro-food, broader agro-food sector. As I made sense of the reports and some of what you said. So whether we're talking about collective bargaining agreements, as in the Spanish case, or other types of labor regulations, inspections, and so on, this is something that came up also as a need, also as you know, feeding into the recommendations for policy. Another thing, another broad theme, one of the main actors actually in this game, is the side of the employers. the employers, especially in the context of the pandemic, lobbying for, counterbalancing labor shortages and, negotiating, which is something we've also seen in the Greek case and several other reports from many other countries, despite an anti-migrant sort of wave in widespread across Europe in the last few years, unfortunately. Perhaps not in every country, but at least in many member states. So one thing is that, but the other is the broader themes of persistent abuses of labor rights, and in particular migrants' rights, perhaps even more pronounced in the case of unregulated, secular, temporary or seasonal labor migration, whether from within the EU or from outside, which is something also misinterpreted perhaps in the public discourse, but also in some studies. And this reflects on, just a comment that I found it interesting here was that what I've seen in the Dutch case, which is also perhaps something, perhaps a small detail, which is something interesting to bring to the fore and perhaps investigate more whether and to what extent it may be the case elsewhere. The personal relationships, the sort of long-term networks that evolve between employers and employees, which is something I found it particular, not seen in any of the other case studies, but I found it particularly interesting at the same time. At the same time, all these have brought to the fore the working conditions, and perhaps one thing that one can easily generalize is that the pandemic and the measures to sort of the responses to it not only made visible what was had a twofold impact in a sense, in terms of both working perhaps, but also living conditions in general. One thing is that it made visible shortcomings and policy gaps and bad conditions that were already existent and brought them to the fore. Another thing was that it created new ones, whether more health related or not. So severely affected in terms of bad working conditions, but what I found interesting is the findings reflecting upon how this, let's say, reflects. That's the correct word, perhaps. Reflects on the living conditions. That is, the halt, for instance, of several sectors or jobs leading to temporary or long-term unemployment during the spring lockdown, for instance, and the spiral effects in not having enough income to sustain yourself and to perhaps maintain a home, which also brought to the fore mostly from the Spanish case, but not only, that's also mentioned in the other cases. The housing issues particularly pronounced again in temporary seasonal workers, especially in agriculture and agri-food sectors, in at least the Netherlands and Poland. I can't recall if there was such a detail for Germany. Forgive me about that. Another theme that seems to be relevant, despite the different levels of detail, perhaps, and the different role within the different country cases, is the role of recruitment agencies, and generally speaking, the recruitment campaigns. And I there liked somehow how Geron called this a business model that perhaps we don't have if I understood well, in your case, that's a clear evidence that they are directly responsible for cases of abuse, but certainly there is a role there that needs to be further investigated and perhaps also regulated as it feeds into some of the policy recommendations that you have drafted. Whilst in some other cases, if I'm not mistaken, in the Spanish one, there are clearly in some many respects. I can't recall in which of the case studies, or perhaps in both, they are themselves the employers, which makes opens the space for nobody has responsibility, as Blanca said, and Berta earlier described and explained. Another theme relates to the direct impact of the mobility restrictions themselves. Yeah, the situations within the pandemic, the lockdown and other measures, whether they, with a vast, let's say, spanning from the uncertainty and the lack of information pronounced or underlined in the police case, for instance, but also not knowing whether, leading to a mass exodus, as I gathered, of a large number of people, 200,000. That's pretty not few as a immediate reactions, let's say, or vice in a sort of reversed way, leading to difficulties, to labor shortages, to difficulties in recruitment, and different measures, not all from governments to respond to the employer's demand and to production needs, not always very successful, as I sort of understood. And a final theme, there are several there, one could talk for longer perhaps, but the final theme could also be perhaps less pronounced in all the cases, but may also relate to the lack of data and the lack of uniform sort of forms of data collection from, or at least, data gathering, because maybe data to some extent are produced by different sort of agents and stakeholders, maybe perhaps, but there's not, they don't come together, they're not sort of made comparable, which does not only inform research and, let's say, our scholarly work, but also policy design. So I probably have spent most of the time, but if I'm allowed to say a couple of things in the policy recommendations, you tell me so. I understand we need to open the floor to questions, so discussion will go on.
Yes, I would like to open the questions for discussion, because maybe by answering the questions, Blanca and Jeroen and Berta are going to respond also to the comment from Panos. That's the way. There is a very interesting question from Ferruccio Pastore. I'm very happy that he is with us. And it's about the agriculture and evidences of a structural change in the composition of labor forces. The question is in Q&A, and could we elaborate a little bit more about this replacement effect and the structural changes? Blanca, do you want to say something? Because I think this Spanish case is the most vulnerable in terms of inflow and outflow of seasonal migrants in the agriculture, and later maybe Jeroen. Okay, and then I'm going to the second question.
Well, this is well, thank you very much, Ferruccio, for this question. As expected, it's a very relevant one, and maybe it could take us quite a lot of time to discuss it. Berta, you may also want to participate and to respond. But basically, I would say that this is a fundamental issue. But of course, in the case of Spain, as part of this demand has been covered by cheap migrant labor, either recruited in their countries of origin or already in Spain, there hasn't been a really important change in terms of industrialization of this sector. And probably this also may have to do with the kind of products. For instance, and Berta knows more about it, but in the case of Huelva, the picking of the strawberries is not easy, and it's difficult to mechanize. So this is in part also behind well, one of the reasons why there haven't been important changes in this regard. Probably more in the case of Lleida. But Berta, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Blanca. Yes, I would just second what Blanca has said. I wouldn't say there has been a structural change in terms of composition of the labor force. The government, I mean, employers were really afraid of who would harvest the fruit because borders were closed and they were not sure about the Eastern Europeans could come to the campaign. And in the case of Huelva, that Moroccan women could join, and actually only a third part of the whole pool of workers could come finally. But in the end, in the case of Huelva, some of the Moroccan women that stayed after March and that were supposed to go back to Morocco, but they stayed because they could not go back. They did some of the jobs, some of the work that the other fellows, the other Moroccan women had to do. So some of this job was covered by the same Moroccan women that stayed longer than what they had initially planned, let's say. And then Eastern Europeans, in the end, it seems that they could come. At least in Lleida, half of the Eastern Europeans, we don't have numbers of that. So that's one of the problems that Panos just said. There's no clear data about how many workers are recruited in agriculture, and it's extremely decentralized. Every employers association and every employer or temp agency has their own database, and it's very difficult to have a clear sense of how many workers are in the agriculture sector and all the profiles within these workers. But talking to an employers association, one of the biggest in Lleida, said that at least half of the Eastern Europeans could come to join the campaign in Lleida. And in the case of Huelva, as I said, some of the Moroccan women did the job of their fellows, and migrant workers that were living in the country already and with this certificate of mobility, they could do the different campaigns. But there were also some other people, mainly of migrant origin, that were working previously in other economic sectors that were deeply affected by the COVID crisis, that were working in hospitality sectors, and this did change the sector and went to agriculture. So there is some changes, globally speaking, but I wouldn't say there has been a really big structural change in terms of composition of labor force. But we could go more into details. It's a long answer. I don't want to take more minutes for that. Thank you for the question.
Okay, Jeroen.
What we see in Germany in particular, but also in the Netherlands, but to a lesser extent, is there's a kind of succession going on. That's the first wave of Central Europeans were Polish. And at some point, the Poles are drying up and are being replaced by people from Bulgaria and Romania, who are cheaper, tend to be cheaper. And of course, in Poland, as we've heard already before, wages are going up. So at some point, it's simply no longer feasible to attract Polish workers to do menial work. And of course, there's also a demographic aspect, which I think the German government is already having in the back of their minds. At some point, the Bulgarians and Romanians are also gone. And then what's next? And so therefore, they already now speak about having these bilateral agreements with the Balkan states, as well as Georgia and even a few other states, I think. So yes, clearly, it's a moving target where to get suitable workers, very clearly.
Okay, if it goes to Poland, as I said, there was an increase in number of temporary migrants in the first lockdown, but then after the summer we noticed that there was a comeback of the temporary migrants, and we achieved the same number of temporary migrants in Poland. And I guess there is no kind of any recruitment programs or recruitment strategies for temporary and seasonal migrants, because there is still not need for that. Knowing that, as I said, that the situation in Ukraine in terms of economic is not very stable, there is still the inflow of temporary migrants. And as I said, this very flexible system of the simplified procedure means that it's accessible even if people need to be tested or need to stay in the quarantine. And there was this problem with the quarantine in the first lockdown, and when migrants decided to come back from Ukraine, but the employers were aware, and they know that due to the demand in foreign workers, they invested in the quarantine and organized the places for migrants to stay. It was 10 days at that time. So, okay, we have other questions. And what measures have there been in place to recruit local labor, Polish, Spanish, Dutch workers, but also migrants who already live in the country? If so, how successful were they? I don't know who wants to add something, a comment, because there was not a Polish case, as I said. In Poland, there was not a visible lack of temporary migrants due to the pandemic. As I said, the first panic wave, the outflow in the first lockdown, but I think that the employers did not receive or face any kind of big troubles in recruiting people. So maybe from our other cases, Blanca.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, because now I'm reading the questions and I realized that I did not respond to Ferrucio's question because I could not hear your the question.
Okay.
I understood it completely wrong, but in fact this question goes in the same direction.
Yeah, direction.
This question, and trying to answer both at the same time, I would say that that in fact the main structural change in terms of how labor demands were covered happened in 2008 with economic crisis. So it was then that the labor demands in agriculture started to be covered more and more by migrants already in the country, and less by those that were every year recruited temporarily for agriculture. So I would say, though, as Berta said, that we don't have the numbers yet, it was too early to have them, but that some of those that were not, or that could not come either from Eastern Europe or from Morocco were indeed covered by again, migrants, but migrants that are already or were already in Spain, and that came back to agriculture in the sense that they were working probably in the tourist sector or in other sectors that were hit by the pandemic, and therefore they came back or they tried to find a job in agriculture, which, as you already know, probably is the same case in Italy, but it's the entry point for many of them. And as soon as they can shift to other sectors, they do. So probably there has been a replacement, but I would say that the main structural change in terms of replacement and shift towards those that were already in Spain was done in 2008 already.
Okay, Jeroen?
I was just thinking that the interviews that I did in Germany pointed into the direction that people who are, for instance, admitted as rejected asylum seekers and can stay, that these are not very popular, let's say, on the fields, because they don't have the per se need to do that type of work, because they are also entitled to welfare. And they do not have the, as someone told me, the right background. They don't come from a culture where working in the field in that particular way, harvesting asparagus, for instance, would make sense. It is not culturally acceptable work. I'm not sure whether that's true, but that's the way they saw it. So I don't see that as maybe in the agri-food sector, when it comes to slaughterhouses, meat packing, and that type of work, maybe. I didn't really look into it. But on the fields and the seasonal work, I don't see employers in large numbers looking at additional migrant labor from what's already domestically available. They tried, and when the first lockdown came, they tried, and they weren't particularly happy with the results.
I just, before I give the floor to Panos for a final word, probably, because I don't see any further question, I would just like to say that in times of pandemic and in times of crisis, migration schemes are particularly, I mean, we can see the weaknesses, like in the Polish case. The system worked quite smoothly in a normal circumstances. But if we look at the pandemic, there was one thing that I should mention. This very simplified procedure is accessible and easy for both sides, but it allows people only to work within one employer. And when it's something wrong during the stay of the temporary migrant in Poland with this one employer, he or she is not able to change it, even being legal in the time of 6 or 9 months in Poland. And it was very relevant in the time of pandemic, because some restaurants and bars were closed. Those people were legal in Poland, but they were not able to switch to another employer, like for the agriculture, for example. So it was the moment in which we should discuss in how flexible the temporary schemes should be, and it's about the right of migrants to be able to change the employer within the time period that they are legal in the country of origin, which is not the case of the system in Poland. So that's just one remark. Panos, I would like to give you the floor to the final word. We are running out of time, I know, and I would like to announce something by the end, but first, Panos with the final.
Okay, thank you very much once again. It seems to be a very interesting discussion that needs to be cut and perhaps continue informally. And I think Patricia's announcement could also relate to that. I don't have much to say. I had since I was invited to comment primarily perhaps on the policy recommendations, I was part of my initial reluctance had to do that it's always not very fulfilling to see a wish list that may make sense or derived from research findings and so on, but may not be realistic, may not be implemented. I haven't seen this in several of the recommendations that were presented here today. And if we also go for the short term or for aim, not go, okay, we're not the ones to go, I guess, but, you know, justifiable and perhaps a bit detailed, then I think this makes sense. I'll keep as a motto what Blanca mentioned, you know, that our security depends on their rights. And this has many different phases and areas for regulation and policy intervention. Let's not forget the role of the civil society. And there are different actors in this game. It's not only migrants and employers and state. And some of the reports really bring this to the fore. And let's also not forget the European dimension, the EU, dimension. Jeroen has underlined the importance of, you know, for both extra-union third country nationals and EU migrants. We can think of, you know, enforcing or implementing existing regulations and controls to safeguard migrants' rights and at the same time labor rights. Perhaps one thing not to be forgotten, at least in the context that we're still facing, in the context of the pandemic, is that access to health is key for the entire population, including migrants, irrespective of their status. And I'm talking as part from the Greek case that at least for asylum seekers, it's been one of the first measures the current Greek government took back in July 2019 to reduce immediate access for newcomers to the country, which is highly problematic in the context of the pandemic. And I also kind of like it's different types of campaigns and dialogue I mentioned in different reports, but perhaps the way in the Dutch recommendations, these Dutch and German recommendation, this is also put as a way to reverse the picture, to reverse the rhetoric, the arguments, and this is also reflected, I think, also in the Polish and Spanish cases, although more at the local level, perhaps, that highlight the importance. The food wheat is produced or packaged or processed by, to a large extent at least, by different groups of migrant workers, and that's important to make sense of, because there is a contrast between reality and needs and perceptions in a Europe that's turning in a dark continent, as literally put in a book a few years ago. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize the last few minutes. Perhaps time is already over. So thank you for the
Yes, it is.
Thank you for the presentations and the work that you have done. This is very inspiring for me.
Thank you, Panos. Thank you very much. I would like to thank very much to all participants. It was a lot of participants, so we are happy. Thank you for all panelists. Thank you, Panos, for your involvement and for your comments. The last thing I would like to say is stay tuned, because the zooming in on migration and asylum is continuing. So they are at least 4 another webinars planned in March, April, May, and June. So after a short break, the webinars are continuing. Please join it and take an active part. Thank you very much, and bye-bye from Poland. Thank you.